Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Nikki Jovicic from Lookupstrata and I'm very happy to welcome our panellists today. This is a morning of firsts. We're very excited to be hosting our first ACT webinar, plus this is the first Q&A webinar where we have featured a number of panellists. Joining us today, we have Jan Browne and Steve Wiebe from Bridge Strata, plus Nina Cannell and Calli Fenwick from Signature Strata. During the session, we'll be discussing everything ACT Strata. Please note that the information discussed today refers solely to ACT legislation. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information contained in this session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in this session. Thank you to all of the people who submitted questions leading up to the event. We'll be addressing these in just a little while, but first we have a few topics to cover. Some of these topics touch on the new legislation for ACT. Nina will be speaking about special privilege rules, default rules and consolidated rules. Calli will be discussing sinking fund forecasts and the maintenance plans. Jan's going to address behavioural rules and guidelines, and Steve is going to be speaking about proxies. Now, depending on how we go, we may also be able to address some of the questions that are submitted during the session. I'm delighted to introduce you to our panellists today. Nina Cannell from Signature Strata. There are very few Canberra strata managers who can boast 20 plus years of professional and practical experience with the level of knowledge and insight that Nina Cannell provides to local practitioners, executive committees and strata communities. Nina is well respected, committed to best practice and passionate about growing the industry's reputation both within the ACT and nationally. Calli Fenwick, also from Signature Strata. Calli is renowned for her tried, trusted and unique service practices. Having held the positions of Strata Manager, Specialist Strata Manager and Strata Business Development Officer over the past 11 years, Calli is highly respected in the field of strata management. Jan Browne of Bridge Strata. Jan has worked in the strata industry since 1988. Jan is a partner and director of Bridge Strata and managing ACT and New South Wales schemes. Jan has been a member of SCA New South Wales for a number of years and served on the Licensed Managers Subcommittee. She's also a member of the SCA National Professional Standards Subcommittee, as well as the recipient of many awards within the strata industry. Steve Wiebe. Steve is a highly regarded senior strata manager with over 13 years experience. Steve has served as the Treasurer for Strata Communities Australia ACT and is also a national recognised and accredited trainer of the A100 Introduction to Strata course for SCA. Both Bridge Strata and Signature Strata regularly contribute to the Lookupstrata blog by responding to questions from our ACT audience. We thank you for your time and knowledge and are delighted to have you here with us today. Welcome to the webinar this morning, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so let's get started. I'll hand you over to Jan first.
Okay, my topic is behavioural rules and guidelines. We're dealing in the strata industry with people's homes and investments, so it becomes a very, very emotional issue when dealing with how people behave, what expectations are. It's become a higher issue at the moment with people working from home, noise. People get more emotional about the issues with motor vehicle parking, animals, than they do their children. The other major issue that we're having is rubbish dumping, illegal dumping, and also recently you've got the additional issue of smoking. These seem to be very topical matters and they all relate to how people behave in a community environment. We've all come across people that really don't know how to behave in a community environment, and then have got on the other side, you've got people who really possibly shouldn't be living in a community environment. So it's a give and take, both sides, and unfortunately some people want more take than give, so it's a balancing act. So hopefully today, by the end of the session, everyone will have more of an understanding of behavioural guidelines and rules and the difference between them. Once you start telling people this is the rule, they become automatically defensive, and possibly should these behavioural matters be called guidelines and not rules. So I'll hand over to Nina and she can expand on rules.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Hi, everybody. So I'll speak to you today about rules and the default rules and special privileges. To tie in with what Jan's been speaking about, I'll start off with rules. So the default rules have been moved with the changes in November last year. They've been moved from the Unit Titles Management Act into the regulations. There have been some changes to those default rules, numbering, content, and the like. So they are quite different in some aspects to the original default rules, which were in the Unit Titles Management Act. Now, with effect from the 1st of November, the second AGM after the 1st of November, all owners corporations must have a consolidated set of rules. So this is a combination of your house or your default rules and what would have previously been your house rules. So the intent there is to have one single set of rules which can be provided to owners to avoid some of that confusion between which are the ones that are current and which ones do you follow, which ones are enforceable and the like. So if your owners corporation hasn't already, you should probably be starting to look at consolidated rules now, because they'll need to go to the second AGM or be registered by the second AGM after the 1st of November 2020. I'll move on to special privileges. So all existing special privileges terminated with effect from the 1st of July 2021. In order for these to be valid, they need to be re-granted under the new provisions of the Act. Section 22 allows the owners corporation to grant special privileges for a period of less than 3 months by special resolution. This was previously an unopposed resolution, so they've eased up on that a little bit. The resolution granting the special privilege must set out conditions of the special privilege, as well as maintenance obligations over the common property for which the special privilege is granted. And these special privileges can be terminated by a special resolution. An owners corporation under section 112A can grant a special privilege for greater than 3 months by way of a special privilege rule. The rule, as with the short-term special privilege, it must set out the conditions of the special privilege as well as maintenance obligations over the area that the special privilege has been granted. Now, the special privilege rule, and indeed any other alternate rule which your owners corporation chooses to adopt, must meet a number of criteria. So they can't be inconsistent with the Act or any other territory law. They can't be incompatible with human rights under the Human Rights Act to be harsh, unconscionable or oppressive, and they can't be inconsistent with any other criteria that's set out in the Act. The technical nature, in particular, of the special privilege rules, our advice to our clients is that they be drafted by a strata experienced lawyer, just to ensure they don't fall foul of any of their requirements. We've seen a couple and they are quite technical in nature, but that's just a change that you would have seen, or you may have seen, coming out of the legislative amendments to do with special privileges. And I think that's all of my topics, so I'll move on to Steve.
Maybe if we just, before Steve gets there, one of the questions it's relating to it is what is special privilege? So we could possibly just quickly answer that while it's within that. Special privileges, if you the owners corporation decide to allow an owner to take over an area of common property for an additional car parking space,
additional living space.
All of those things. It could be airspace. So it's relating to common property, a special privilege over common property that benefits one particular owner.
Okay. So, for example, in an A-class building, solar panels up on the roof, or signage out on the front facade of the building, especially for commercial places such as Mitchell, Fishwick, anything like that. Most of those will be A-class buildings, so you would need to get special privilege to be able to use that space.
So it's essentially any area where a single owner is granted exclusive use of an area of common property for their benefit.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that clarification.
All right. So thank you very much. I'm talking about proxies today. Since the 1st of November that Nina spoke of before, the changes, there have been limits placed on the amount of proxies that any one person, apart from the chairperson now, can hold. So it's maximum of 5% for owners corporations with 20 or more units. If it's under 20, one person can only hold one proxy. And since those amendments, the approved proxy form must be issued with the notice of meeting, and this means that no management company can actually provide their own form. It has to be the approved form that is downloadable from the legislation website. For those of you who don't know it, that's legislation.act.gov.au, and search for Unit Titles Management Act, and we'll have everything there for you listed. Why has there been changes? Now, they've been put into place to stop the instances of proxy farming. Previously, we've had issues where owners have been going around knocking on doors of people saying, if you're not attending, can you please, or not so nice, saying, give me your proxy so I can represent you. As I said before, complexes less than 20 units, the maximum number of proxies for one owner is 1, and for complexes with 20 or more, they cannot number greater than 5%. Since those changes, and interestingly, when those changes came into effect, that also affected the chairperson, meaning the chairperson could only hold a maximum of 5% of those proxies. We have since had some amendments to it, which now allows that the chairperson to have unlimited amount of proxies. Interestingly as well, since with this new amendment, once one person has their 5%, any additional ones automatically refer back to the chairperson. All right. And I think that's, so I do have one note here to say, but we're discussing building defects. However, the builder is still an owner, and I'm worried that they could vote down any action we decide to take. Schedule 3, Part 3.3, Section 3.21a specifically states that developers of a units plan is not entitled to vote or exercise proxy votes in relation to a motion relating to building defects unless the owner's corporation has passed a special resolution allowing the developer to vote, or the ACAP makes a declaration allowing that developer to vote on such motions. All right. So if we would pass on to Calli.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. So I'm talking to you today a little bit about sinking fund forecasts and maintenance plans. So obviously we've had a lot of questions from owners since the change, because a lot of people have a little bit of confusion and think that they're potentially the same thing, and there's no requirement to have a maintenance plan, because isn't that what the sinking fund plan is for? So they are a little bit different, and most of you are probably quite familiar with the term or sinking fund forecast and sinking fund plan, because they're not something that's newly come in. They've been in place since 2011. However, still something quite important to talk about. So essentially the difference is that the sinking fund plan or your sinking fund forecast is a report, so 10 to 15 years, sometimes they're a little bit longer, and they're required to make sure that you are essentially contributing to your sinking fund, and your sinking fund levy contributions are in line with that forecast. So that forecast is mostly done by an independent contractor. You know, QIA is very common, so most of you probably have QIA, but obviously there's other people that do them as well. And historically, some owners corporations, the committees used to do some of their forecasts and things as well. Essentially, the sinking fund forecast is for your capital works. So it's easier to remember if you think of sinking as capital works and capital works fund. So they'll incorporate everything like replacement of your lift, replacement of your fencing, big capital, big ticket items that you need to replace. So essentially the plan is designed so that you contribute proportionally over a number of years, so that when your lift needs replacement or roof works or something that's a big ticket item that's very expensive, painting's a big common one. So you can't come up with $400,000 or $800,000 like that. So what you need to do is obviously contribute over a period of 5, 10 years, 15 years, so that when the painting does need to be redone or the lift does need replacing or any of those other really expensive items, you've already paid throughout the years so that you have the funds obviously available when that work needs doing. So once you have adopted your sinking fund forecast, which obviously normally happens at a AGM or a general meeting, so the Owners Corporation will generally adopt your forecast. Once you have adopted that report, that incorporates all of those items that you need to obviously save for in the future. You then must contribute your levies for your sinking according to your sinking fund forecast. So once it's adopted, that's obviously the determining factor that then determines your sinking fund contributions, which is something that's really important, and many people forget that. So that plan is actually a really, really important tool to, for all of your capital works in the future, and it is amendable, so you can amend it at any time. So if people are going to, you know, it says to paint in 2023 or 2025, that's not 100% set. If you need to move your painting forward or back a couple of years because it takes a while to get quotes, or, you know, things like COVID happen and contracts are pushed, that's okay. You can move, you know, those works like painting and things forward or back a couple of years. But it's the important factor is that you are saving towards it, so you do have the funds available when you need to do it. And it is also important that it is reviewed every 5 years. And obviously, if you are going to paint or any of that, all of that information is given to the contractor when you go to review your sinking fund plan. So then once it's reviewed, all of your contributions and things will obviously be adjusted from that point onwards as well. So really, really effective tool. So the difference between that and then your maintenance plan, the maintenance plan is something that has been introduced as a requirement for owners corporations from the legislative reform on the 1st of November 2020. So owners corporation must prepare a maintenance plan. And the difference between that and your sinking fund is that it's not for capital works. It's more to do with your administrative fund. So a maintenance plan must include all of the items in infrastructure and common property that require regular servicing. So think about, yes, your lifts will still need servicing, and so will your fire control and everything like that. But it's going to incorporate things like your garage maintenance, your sump pumps, your air conditioning, all of those things that most likely are going to be an annual or a quarterly or a monthly service. So that plan will incorporate all of those things, and then it will help you make sure that you're budgeting in your administrative fund for the servicing of all of those items. So it's really important to have both reports. Again, that report can be reviewed at any time on a needs basis, and it will be has to be reviewed. Are you writing a meter?
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought they were giving me a note. Yeah, you will be required to review your maintenance plan as well. And it can be reviewed on an as needs basis, but it must be reviewed at the 5-year mark. I think that's correct, isn't it? Yeah, it has to be reviewed at that 5-year mark as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, do the maintenance plans as well. I can see that question that's come through. So you don't have to. Again, there's a lot of people that already have sort of like an asset register and something like that, but there obviously have very specific requirements that are detailed in the legislation to say what must be included in a maintenance plan. So we certainly would recommend for the professional company like QAA, or, you know, you might have had an engineer already do an asset maintenance plan that you would then incorporate into a slightly different maintenance plan document. But yeah, QAA are doing a lot of them. Engineers and other companies are doing a lot of them as well. But we would certainly recommend that it's professionally done, because there are very set parameters of what must be included in that plan, and obviously at what frequency those items need to be serviced and maintained. And it has to include all of the items that would reasonably be considered that if you didn't maintain them, that they had the potential to fail or break and things like that. So it's really just making owners corporations take responsibility from both, you know, an admin servicing and a capital works servicing perspective.
Peter, I see your question there about the recent ACAT ruling and the confusion on sinking fund expenditure. It certainly has cast some doubt about how we as strata practitioners all treat the sinking fund. It's something which is currently being referred to the SCA board to seek further clarity and advice on. If you read the case notes specific to the actual ruling, there were very specific circumstances. So, for example, as an example, it was an old terracotta roof tiles, and part of the owner or half of the owners wanted to actually replace that with a colour bonder roof. So, an upgrade when the existing roof was completely functional. So whilst it does create some doubt, it's unclear whether or not it will apply more broadly to upgrades and replacements like for like or otherwise. So we're hoping to get some, through SCA, we're hoping to get some further clarity on that. And once we do know, we'll be able to publish something through the SCA. But at the moment, it's still casting a little bit of doubt and something which we're all still looking into.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Sorry, Nikki, another question about the Airbnb and the QR code. At the moment, the industry has to follow public health directions, and whatever comes under that direction as to what classifies as a business having to have that QR code. At the moment, Canberra is not in any strict regime except for your retail, your shoppings, other areas of a lot of people that are coming together. So whatever's under the current public health direction is what we can follow. Owners corporations could go out and have a certain rules, but it will, by the time they registered that, would they be enforceable? Because again, a rule cannot override legislation. So the public health direction is the one that dictates what an owners corporation or what any business has to follow.
Okay, well, we've got a few other questions that have come in as well to do with sinking funds and maintenance plans as well, but we might just leave those and hopefully get back to them at the end of the session and just to address some of the questions that we had submitted, if that's okay. So we'll see how we go for time, and if not, we'll certainly get back to people with answers at a later date if we don't have the time to cover them in the session this morning. So we might just go to, there's a question about bylaws or rules. How do we get the bylaws for our units plan? How do you register new bylaws, and how do you make changes to the bylaws? And Nina, I believe you're answering this one.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Nikki. So as we touched on before, bylaws in the ACT are referenced as rules, and with the legislative amendments released in November, an owners corporation is now required to have a single set of consolidated rules. This in part will make it easier in time to obtain a copy of your house rules or your rules, because there won't be various copies all over the place. Essentially, they should be readily available from your strata manager or your owners corporation. They are part of the owners corporation's records, so there's no reason why owners can't actually have a copy of those. In fact, they should be provided to all owners and all tenants as they occupy the building. They may also be available on the owners portal if you have access to an owners portal, or they should be on there. And if you're looking at purchasing a new unit or you're new to an owners corporation, it will also be included in your sales contract or your Section 119 certificate. So they should be something which are very easily accessible to owners and residents. In terms of registering new bylaws, a draft set of rules would need to be presented to a general meeting of all owners for their consideration. And once passed by a special resolution by the owners corporation, they can then be registered as a formal set of rules under the common seal of the owners corporation. Important thing to note is when you are changing rules, they have to be registered within 3 months of the resolution being passed. Otherwise, you have to go right back to the beginning of the process and pass that resolution, that special resolution again. Changing bylaws or rules is essentially exactly the same as the step before, all the way through from presenting the draft right through to the process of registration with Access Canberra.
Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, we might move on to another one. And then this one's to do with who's responsible. We get lots of questions around this type of topic. So I've been informed by my strata manager that I'm responsible for a leaking pipe, allegedly from my bathroom. The pipe's located under my floor, which forms part of the common property of my building. I'm on the second floor. My downstairs neighbour has reported the leak. Essentially, I'm aware that I'm responsible for any water pipe that solely services my property, but said leaking pipe is in the common property of the building. It's located in my floor, in my downstairs neighbour's ceiling. Is this a grey area? Who is responsible? And Steve, I'll throw to you for that one.
Yep. Thank you for that, Nikki. Basically, thanks, Brett. There is no common property in between two units. So if you've got a unit underneath and a unit above, there is no common property. The midway point is where people are responsible for up to. So if the leaking pipe is servicing your unit only, doesn't matter where it is located, even if it's on common property, you are responsible for the repair of that. For example, if it's your drain pipe, now I'm assuming it's your drain pipe coming through the floor from your showers leaking into the unit below, then despite where that pipe is located and not so much easily accessible from your unit, you are still responsible as the owner of the unit that is for that infrastructure. The OC will only become responsible once the pipe ties into a common stack, or where there's two pipes from two different units joining in to head towards the common stack as well. So in this instance, it looks like you're going to have to get to know your neighbour downstairs and go and knock on their door and say, hey, I understand you've got a leak. I'm going to need to pop in and fix it, and it's because it's coming from my drain. So, yeah.
Okay. And if you are the downstairs neighbour and you look up and see a leak in the ceiling, what's the best course of action at that point?
Contact your strata manager, who'll be able to actually then contact the owner of the unit above, or the property manager if it is tenanted. And then we can actually start helping the property manager or the owner to facilitate contact between the two owners.
Excellent, thank you.
One extra thing on that, Steve, it's possibly go up and knock on your neighbour's door. We had one the other night where an elderly lady had actually fallen asleep in the kitchen, and the tap was running in the kitchen, so the water was overflowing, and they had to get the fire brigade to break into the unit to wake her up and to turn the tap off. And sometimes it can be something as simple as that, where someone's left a tap running and or the bath overflowing, and you just knock on their door and at least stop it is the first initial stages.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jan. Okay, this one is to do with, well, I'll read through it. It's to do with commercial units in a mixed-use building. So I represent an owners corporation committee in Canberra for a medium-sized strata of 41 units. This is a 4-storey building, including 4 ground level commercial unit owners. The strata is 12 years old. All commercial unit owners are struggling to either trade or sublet their spaces. Long term, this seems to be due to better located competition and more recently COVID. Can the ground floor commercial unit premises be changed to or converted into residential unit space? And Calli, I'll throw to you for this one.
Thanks. So it's a really good question, and it is a really broad sort of question without having more detail. So it's really hard to answer. Can the ground floor units be changed or converted into a residential unit space without us having the information on your lease purpose clause, what's in your DA, and what's those units are permitted to be? So it really depends on those conditions that obviously detail what your units are allowed to be. So the lease purpose clause form 4 and 5 of your units plan determines what each unit within a whole building is allowed to be used as, and there's different categories. So some are purely residential, some are commercial, mixed use, and then obviously there's further in terms of can it be a hospital or a medical centre and things like that. So there are a lot of restrictions. So it's not a clear-cut answer without looking at what is in your form 4 and 5. So that's your first point of call. Have a look at your units plan and your lease purpose clause with those forms 4 and 5, which actually determine what they can be used as, those units. That would be your first step. And then obviously you might need to submit a DA application to change what they're allowed to be permitted for. And that's something that you'd need to seek, further legal advice on and things like that. Or obtain further advice about if you go down that road, depending on what is already contained in there.
Okay, wonderful. All right, I'll move on to the next one. Our unit plan recently introduced a code of conduct as an alternative to the default rules. The code was developed within our unit plan, but modified by our managing agents. Our rules have now been registered in the ACT. At the same time, we modified other parts of the default rules to include special provisions for keeping of pets. Are alternate rules legal and enforceable? And what procedures do we have to follow to ensure the new rules are enforceable? Jan?
Yes, basically, if they're registered rules, they are enforceable so long as they're not in breach of any other legislation. And it's not only the Unit Titles Management Act that we talk about here, we talk about local government acts, we also talk about Discrimination Act. So there's a lot of other legislation that needs to be considered when making alternative rules. The default rules are the best way to start and then add to them, but be very conscious that if they are in breach of those other legislations, it makes it very difficult.
So would you recommend they'd be best to seek legal advice when making changes?
Definitely. I think that this is an area where if you do have a rule and you want to enforce it, you want to make sure that you're on solid ground. There's been some interesting decisions made in the different tribunals throughout Australia. So it's best that an owners corporation feels that they have the correct advice and that they're confident going forward that their rules will be enforceable.
Thank you. Steve, now I believe this one's for you. We own a 2-bedroom unit in Canberra. The bedrooms face onto the carports. Recently, very bright light was installed in the carports, which now shines straight into the bedrooms. The installer claims to have met the standards for night lighting, but will not provide the standards to us. I believe the ACT regulations state that nighttime lighting should not intrude into bedrooms. The executive committee refuses to answer our questions and the strata manager is being extremely difficult. We've put a complaint into the ACT government, excuse me, but we are still awaiting their response. Is there any other action we can take to speed this along?
So, thank you for that. Basically, from how this is worded, looks as if that the light's been installed on the common property and also under the authorisation of the executive committee. Now, the executive committee has a duty of care to all owners and residents to ensure that the items installed on common property is not adversely affecting individual residents. As this is a common area and area installation that is causing the issue for you, the EC is obligated to provide you with answers, and those answers should be backed up with proof of compliance to the ACT regulations. Unfortunately, I don't believe that there's any way to speed things along through the ACT government. However, as an owner, you do have the right to be able to take action against the EC if they are not forthcoming with answers for you. I'd be suggesting you contact the manager and advise them of a reasonable time frame, say 7 days to 14 days for a response from the EC. And if they're not forthcoming by that stage, you actually take the initiative and look at lodging action through the ACAT, which is ACT Civil and Administrative Tribunal. I can never say those words properly, especially all together. So hopefully that's answered the question. But yes, in essence, there is no way to really speed this up through the ACT government. As we know, the ACT government can be notoriously slow on some things. So yeah, that's my advice.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question that was submitted about consolidated rules. So we'll have you answer this one, Nina. When the rules included in the consolidated rules would have already been previously accepted at general meetings, do consolidated rules need to be adopted at a general meeting of all owners?
Well, certainly my interpretation of the Act is yes, they do need to be registered. Although if you haven't registered any alternate rules by the first or the formally adopted the default rules or adopted any alternate rules by your second AGM after the 1st of November, the new default rules contained within the regulation will automatically apply. I still think there is a requirement to register them. For a number of reasons. The numbering, as I touched on before, has changed. The content of the rules themselves have changed. And if you don't register something that you've put the time into to develop yourselves, to put the amendments to, it will be the default rules as they're published. So it'll still be the Owners Corporation by an unopposed resolution having to approve alterations in a diff or special resolution now. So it will be as they're published. You won't be able to have any kind of customised rules if you don't do that. So yes, my interpretation is yes, they do still need to be registered. That's certainly in the intent.
Okay, thank you. Despite being a very small owners corporation, our strata manager appears to have made a complete mess of our books. As only one of the many errors, items that should be charged to the sinking fund have been charged to the admin fund. We're thinking that we will need an audit to get things sorted out properly. Given this situation has been caused by the strata manager, can we insist that they pay for the audit? Does poor and unprofessional financial management such as this constitute grounds for notable breach of contract? Jan?
Yes, first off, has there been dialogue with your strata manager? Sometimes it's just a matter of miscoding of invoices from admin to sinking. Normally, if it's renewing an item, it is, or brand new replacement of a major item, it goes into the sinking fund. If it's an everyday working account, then it would normally go into the administrative fund. It would also relate to what your budget was and what the resolutions were for that year for the expenditure. But there are items that do come up unexpectedly during the year. And if the committee has access to the portal, then they're able to check on a regular basis the financials of the owners corporation. And if they feel that an amount has been charged against the admin and they'd like it to go against the sinking, then it's certainly an easy option to send an email to the strata manager and ask them to recode it across to the sinking fund. Without knowing the specifics, it's very hard to know whether the actions of the strata manager are negligent. An audit will cost money, and you do allude that it's a small plan. Whether you could force the strata manager to pay for that audit would have to again be a negotiation. And most audit certificates is a one-page thing stating that the money has been spent against that expenditure. You would need to pay an additional amount of money if you're wanting a forensic audit, or you would want to go higher, which would then give you further financial advice. So the first step is to talk to your strata manager and ask about recoding. If there are so many codes that have been incorrectly coded, it means it's going to be putting an additional deficit in your administrative or your sinking fund for items that haven't been budgeted for.
Okay, thanks, Jan. What can an owners corporation do to reduce water excess amounts? I manage a few owners corporations that have water excess payments of $25,000 and $50,000. Calli, can you assist with that one?
Yeah, so I guess first it's really determining 100% if you mean excess water. So if it's excess water, as in it's $25,000 to $50,000 over what they normally would pay at the same time last year or over the last couple of years, if you're comparing their bills, then obviously there's a problem because that is a huge amount to be over from, historically. So obviously, first thing we would do if we were seeing a bill that was $25,000 or $50,000 over was getting a plumber out, because it's a clear indication to us that there must be a leak or something, a major issue with the water, something's leaking somewhere for it to be that much over. If you're referring to just they're a bit excessive, as in, last year it was 20 and this year it's 25, and they're just incrementally increasing, and the bills are creeping up, and you're trying to look at ways to reduce your water usage, obviously the first item would be just to make sure, again, obviously always make sure that there's no leaks and things, but obviously check things like your irrigation. Buildings with a lot of gardens and irrigation on perhaps all the time rather than just on, during spring rather than winter when they're not needed and things like that, or on for too long rather than a couple of hours each day as, we've had a wet season or something like that. If you're trying to reduce your costs, obviously irrigation is the first thing to have a look at. If the owners corporation are really, really serious about cutting their water costs and, there's no leaks, it's not irrigation and things like that, then it's going to be about a community discussion with your neighbours about how much they're using. Are they, watering their gardens by hose all the time and things like that? Or perhaps even looking at installing water tanks and things like that. So really there's the two things, and I wasn't exactly sure if the question was, it's just they want to reduce their water or actually in excess of $25,000, because that definitely get a plumber out there as soon as possible to check that there's not a leak.
Okay, and then we've just had a comment come in based on that question saying, can this question be asked in relation to insurance excesses of $50,000? So I guess they're saying if your insurance is starting to creep up, is there anything that you can do about that as well?
Yes.
As in the insurance excess, sorry, Ali, I'm trying to understand the question. Are you referring specifically to your insurance excess of over 50,000?
If that's the case, then we're finding that a lot of are correct for insurance for water leaks.
So in some instances, yes, you can claim on investigative costs on your insurances, especially if it turns out that there has been a water leak. It is certainly possible to actually claim that as investigative costs. But again, check with your insurance brokers or the insurance company that you use, and they'll be able to tell you correct as well.
Worth submitting a claim and attempting to, and obviously depending on what's covered in your policy, they can or cannot be knocked back.
Anything to answer that one.
Yeah, the causation is the important thing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the clarification there. Does a 2-unit development with 4 part owners mean the owners corporation has 4 members? As such, can a poll vote be called by any member of the OC for an ordinary resolution? Or does it mean that since we are a 2-unit development, the owners corporation only has 2 members and as such a poll vote cannot be called? Nina?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so all owners essentially form part of the owners corporation or are members of the owners corporation. However, under section 3.22 of the Act, only a single vote is exercisable per unit. So with the dual occupancy unit, you've got 2 votes which are exercisable. Units which have a shared ownership or part owners, the part owners must appoint an authorised representative under division 2.3. So it should be on the record which of those part owners is responsible for the functions of the owner in voting, exercising voting and the like. Section 3.15 states that an owners corporation with 1 or 2 members, in order for an ordinary resolution to be passed, no votes can be cast against the motion, and at least 1 vote must be cast. Sorry, no votes can be cast against the motion, and at least 1 vote must be cast in favour of the motion. The Act is silent on a dual occupancy calling for a poll. It does go in and give specifications for calling a poll in 3 units and greater. The silence of the Act on dual occupancy calling a poll suggests that it is not permitted. So essentially, any decision which can't be resolved by the parties would end up in ACAT for them to make the ruling or on whatever it is. So, yeah, being 2 owners, there's no ability to call a poll.
Okay, thank you. And that is always a concern with smaller funds, isn't it, where you've got equal number of owners?
Yeah, can get tricky if there's owners that don't necessarily see eye to eye.
Okay, I'm concerned that in an attempt to keep owners corporation fees low, insurance policies covering replacement of building structure in the event of catastrophic fire are not keeping pace with the real cost of a square metre building replacement costs. Can the owners corporation be forced to show owners the actual replacement values currently covered by our insurance agreements? And can the owners corporation be forced to insist on making increases in quarterly charges so as to keep up with real replacement costs? Steve, I believe you're answering this one for us.
Yes. Now, in under the Unit Titles Management Act, Division 5.4 addresses the insurance requirements for the owners corporation, which states that it has to, and which tells you exactly what it has to take out. However, there's no mandate for the owners corporation to undertake insurance valuations at any time. Standard practice is, I always recommend to my clients every 3 to 5 years to have your building valued for insurance purposes. And again, going back, QIA and other companies do those as well. So most of the policies cannot will not provide it per unit. You will need to get your certificate of currency from your from your strata manager. Could be on your owner's portal. I also include it in my any of my agendas to go out for executive for the owners corporation annual general meetings. I include my certificate of currency in there as well, and that states exactly how much the building is actually insured for. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't go into what each individual unit is insured for. Have I got any other notes? So yeah, that's all the notes that I had on that. But yeah, so the owners corporation is required to provide you with your certificate of currency, which shows exactly what the building is insured for. And I would be recommending that you put forward a motion at the next annual general meeting or the next general meeting, if one's called, to have your building insured for valued for insurance purposes.
Thank you. Okay, the next one, this is a big one, Jan, something that we get asked in every Q&A webinar that we've had. How do you stop residents from parking in visitor parking spots?
Yeah, I wish we had the answer to that. I think you'd get a gold star if anyone did come up with a solution. And I did mention it in my opening remarks that the major issues used to be parking, illegal parking, pets and children, and now illegal dumping and smoking seem to be the big issues. And there is no answer to that. No one's found a solution to it. We live in a throwaway society these days. It's easy to throw something away and replace it with the cost of it, especially in Canberra, where we are an affluent society in most of the areas, and the cost of things coming in from overseas. CCTV won't always catch the culprits, but it will act as a deterrent. And we're finding that a lot more plans are putting in CCTV cameras in those garbage areas. It also is not always from within the complex. If you have a large common rubbish area, you'll find that people in the streets sometimes will dump their rubbish in there as well. It really is up to the owners within the complex to be proactive in looking at various items. We get notifications sometimes, Unit 5 moved out yesterday and there's a whole heap of stuff in the rubbish area. And you can go back to the letting agent and ask, did they leave it there? And some residents just think, oh, well, all they see is that it gets taken away. They don't even realise that it costs money. You can put up as much signage as the owners corporation can afford, and people aren't going to really look at it. It's really changing people's ideas and perception. You cannot dump rubbish, but as far as they're concerned, it gets taken away. As I said, a deterrent is CCTV, or the people in the complex become more proactive in looking and seeing what happens. And also going through it, sometimes you'll find a box with an address on a label, and you can identify the rubbish then. But there's no easy answer, and I wish we did have the answer, because it's costing owners, you as owners, additional funds for all those extra rubbish removals.
With regards to rubbish removal as well, just adding to what Jan has spoken about with the CCTV, if you've got the capacity at your development to secure or put locking mechanisms on your garbage enclosure areas, you can actually, and we've had a couple of complexes that do this, they have the electronic fob access to get into the garbage enclosures. That combined with CCTV, you can often identify the unit number by what's being dumped and the presentation of the access device, which allows you to get in contact with those people and recover those costs under Section 31. But they can be costly additions. Sometimes it might cost more than the ongoing cost of removing it, but it's something worth investigating by the committee.
And on parking, again, depending on how big of a problem it is, and some owners corporations obviously closer to the city or you know, built up areas where there's a lot of workers parking and their visitors parking and things like that, and they've got a number of spaces, install bollards and things like that. So like remote control bollards that obviously only residents have. So a car couldn't park over the top of it unless somebody who lived in the building could remote access it down, or, you know, there's various different mechanisms. But again, that still doesn't stop residents using visitor parking. That will only stop the general public using visitor parking. So it's something that every owners corporation has to deal with, and it just really has to be a discussion on the severity versus how much time and effort do you put into policing or monitoring it or deterring it versus what result you're going to achieve with that investment of time.
For those properties basically in the city as well,
Yeah.
you could also look at gazetting the building, so gazetting any of the common
With the
area
ACT government.
area parking, registering it with the ACT government. ACT parking enforcement officers will come around and they will fine people that have been parked there for, you need to put up there to say 1 hour parking, 2 hour parking, or however long you want to make it. But then the ACT government will come along and actually fine people.
But that is an expensive process. So it would have to definitely be something that's really a problem and worth it, because it could cost, you know, an owners corporation a few $1,000s, because you need to supply a traffic management plan. So it is quite expensive, and it would only be something that I would recommend, you know, in those built up areas where it's a huge, huge problem.
Okay, and can it be helped with a change of rules when you're going through the consolidation process, whether you can introduce some rules that would assist with the visitor parking?
Again, it all comes down to the ability to police and enforce it. You can have all the rules in the world, if they can't be enforced, it's just sort of a piece of paper that it's written on. And parking and dumping of rubbish is one of those things which is quite difficult because it is a moving feast. It's always changing. The people doing it are always changing, and
you don't always know who it is.
That's right.
You don't know who the culprit is, so you can't.
That's right.
Take any action if it's just a general member of the public.
If anybody can come up with a solution for it, I know the strata managers would be very happy.
That's right, and you can't basically put labels on the cars. They were doing those a few years ago, sticky labels, and you can't clamp them either, and you can't tow them, unfortunately. So yes, and the pop-up bollards we're actually looking at in the complex at the moment, and they're putting the pop-up bollards on every visitor car park, and residents are being given 2 keys each. So we'll see if that works.
Yes.
Okay.
And for how long?
And for how long?
It is. It's a hard one. Is there any ACT legislation around noise from common areas, or conventions around who's responsible to address it? Is it the owner's corporation or just the owner that's affected? And Jan, I believe you're answering that one as well.
Again, a noise. These are all behavioural issues, are they not? And I do have a saying, and you can't legislate personalities and stupidity, and sometimes they go hand in hand, and some people's personalities feel that they have a higher right to do certain things, even though it disturbs the peaceful enjoyment of other residents. So realistically, there are in the ACT, Access Canberra has a portal on how noise is managed in the ACT, and you can make a complaint via that, depending what the noise is. If it's parties and it's disturbing your peaceful enjoyment of your unit, then you would send an email through to the manager, and the manager is able to chase up direct with the owner or the letting agent of that unit. It is a good idea that if you do submit a complaint, that if it's disturbing other residents and that as well, that you get them to co-sign it, so it doesn't come up as a he said, she said, and it doesn't become a tit for tat scenario, which we as strata managers see a lot. Unit 4 can make a complaint about Unit 5. We register it. Unit 5 comes back against Unit 4. Yeah. We, as strata managers, we do not get involved with personal conflict, and so if you have those complaints substantiated, we can then follow through. The normal course of action would be with the letting agent, if it's rented, with the owner direct. If the complaints continue, there would need to be a meeting of the committee to instruct the manager to issue what's called a rule infringement notice. That rule infringement notice puts the resident on notice that if they continue, it could go to the next level. If it then continues, it then will end up in tribunal. And the first level of tribunal is a conciliation, which is like a mediation. If it can't be resolved then, it then will go to a hearing. And the person who is making the noise can be fined at that final hurdle for the owners corporation. Doesn't technically stop them, but it will certainly deter them. But that is a lengthy process. So it's certainly not going to happen overnight, but sometimes people aren't aware of the noise that they're making. The gym upstairs, the gym upstairs with the dropping of the weights and everything, that they don't realise that, as Nina said, the noise transfers to such an extent. The bed hitting the wall when someone's enjoying marital relationships, they don't understand that either. So it's just a matter of mentioning it to them.
We do encourage
I was
people.
going to say that one would be a very awkward conversation.
I have had that one to deal with.
So would you encourage that lot owners approach other lot owners and other units, or is that the way to do it initially?
Yeah, certainly the first step is to go and speak to your neighbour. Always speak to the neighbour first. If it comes from us, it then puts the first line of defence is offence. So, you know, if you get a complaint, you're going to attack. It's just our nature to do that. So always speak to them, try to come to an arrangement or just point it out that it is causing an issue for you. But please don't go and complain to the poor person upstairs, the mother with the crying baby who hasn't had any sleep for 2 days.
Oh, and as Peter Salapatis has just pointed out, the strata manager should be the bad cop in that. So if I had an issue with my neighbour that was making noise and I went and knocked on the door and got nowhere with them, then I would go to my strata manager and get them to initiate their process. So I can understand where Peter's coming from with the OCM being the bad cop.
Yeah. We're the facilitator. We're the buffer. The buffer.
It just depends on the relationships of people on site, and whether or not you're comfortable as well speaking to the neighbour, at the type of noise, the type of person that it is. There's so many circumstances which will change how it is addressed. Even the type of noise will change how it's addressed. But if it's a situation where you're comfortable saying, like more likely a noise that they're not aware of, you're better off, if you can, if you're comfortable, just knocking on their door, because it might just keep the peace a little bit more than, and it might avoid having to get official with it.
Okay, and then the next question we had was to do with smoking, and I would imagine it's a very similar response that you would be giving for smoking and smoke drift as well. Is that right?
Yes, and I think if people want some more information on the smoking, I know that I've done a couple of articles for Lookupstrata on smoking, and it's an evolving beast when it comes to smoking at this time. ACT, there's been no case studies as far as I'm aware or rulings in ACT yet, but there certainly has been in New South Wales. And we would recommend that an owners corporation have model rules on smoke penetration and smoking, and that could be an alternative rule, and it needs to be registered. I have in Lookupstrata, there are some links there for some previous suggestions, and they're based on the New South Wales, which also has been to NCAT, and there are rulings and that in there. And New South Wales have got the model bylaws on smoke penetration, which owners corporations are adopting. It is a difficult one for smoke penetration coming from a unit to another unit. There's so many cracks in the flooring and out the window, but in that suggested rules, it is that it's up to the responsibility of the unit below not to have smoke penetrate that is going to cause an annoyance to another owner. The owner's corporation can ban smoking on common property, possibly within courtyards, but when you get to the individual unit, does it then defy people's natural rights of living by banning it? It's a hot potato, and it will keep evolving until there is a ruling in ACAT.
We don't have one yet. ACT is a bit different to other jurisdictions. In Calli, I believe it's classified as a disability. Smoking is classified in the ACT as a disability, which makes it a little bit more difficult to try and ban it. So it'll be, that's another one I think that all strata managers or practitioners are waiting on a case in ACAT. So we have the direction for that one.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. And we might include a couple of the links to the articles that you've previously written as well in the email that we send out later today, Jan, so people can have a read up on that as well. But I think that we've come up to, we're actually just gone over the hour, so we might actually leave it there. But thank you so much for the information and for the time. We've got quite a few questions. I've tried to copy them down as best I can while we've been having the conversation. So hopefully we'll be able to get back to those people. I'll send the questions through and we'll get some responses back as soon as we can, sort of over the next couple of weeks, and keep an eye out for those coming through. And if you have any other questions that weren't submitted and you weren't able to get in touch with us today, please feel free to jump on the Lookupstrata site and pop a question in the Ask a Strata question page for us, and we'll get those through to you as quickly as we can. We'd just like to ask at the end of the session if anyone's got anything that they'd like to mention about news that's coming up or special events or something that they'd like to mention.
The only thing probably worth mentioning is the media release which came out yesterday in regards to combustible cladding in the ACT. So as people will probably be aware, we're a fair way behind the 8 ball when it comes to cladding. So the government made a press release yesterday that they will be contributing 50% of investigative costs up to a total of, I think it was $20,000. And also looking at concessional loans for rectification. It's still... it's a long way short of what I think we as practitioners were hoping for, and you as client and owners corporations were also hoping of. So there'll be various aspects or various parts of the industry that will still be working on that. And as information comes to hand, it'll be released. So just very early days yet.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for that really quick recap, Nina. And it was only something that came out yesterday, as you said, so it's all quite new. And we'll also include, I think SCA has just put a media release out, so we'll include a link to that in the email as well, and people can have a read up on that. So thank you so much. So I'd just like to say thank you very much. This was a great session. We weren't sure how it would go with 4 of us on the table there, but 4 of you on the table, but it worked really well. And we thank you for the time. And I know you put lots of time and effort into it leading up to the event as well. So we really appreciate that. And thank you so much for joining us, everyone from the ACT. Really happy to bring this to you today as a first Q&A for ACT, and hopefully we'll have many more. We really appreciate the support from our audience in ACT, so thank you. And keep an eye out for our regular publications, and we'll see you at a session again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.